Well, for more on this, I'm joined by retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. He's in our studio in Washington. Mr. Kimmitt, good to have you with us. Now, should the U.S. and coalition partners be held accountable for these deaths?
Well, I think they should be investigated. I think every one of these strikes should be looked at to see if there was an intentionality on the part of the United States and its coalition partners to cause civilian deaths and injuries. And I think they ought to be fully investigated to see if, in fact, there were reasons and other ways they could have avoided this. But I think that's exactly what the coalition forces do now, which is why I'm not necessarily concerned about what is being written in this report, because I know that over time it has been established that these types of reports are missing key context.
What is that key context that they're apparently missing?
Well, first of all, I think it needs to be understood that in international law that there is an illegality to perfidy, the use of the enemy of civilians as human shields. That's absolutely illegal, and it is clear that the enemy will typically do this to try to create these types of casualties intentionally. Number two, there's got to be some consideration of intent. Having been in this business before, I know that dozens and dozens, the vast majority of these types of strikes are waved off because of the risks of casualties to civilians. And in those where the risk is seen to be very, very small, under those circumstances and those circumstances alone can these strikes be carried out.
General Kimmitt, this report says, and I quote, tens of thousands of artillery strikes were indiscriminate. Now, as a former high-ranking member of the Army, just take us through how decisions are made on the battlefield and with regards to airstrikes like these.
Well, first of all, you've got to distinguish between artillery strikes and airstrikes. In the case of airstrikes, they obviously have very, very precise overhead imagery. In the case of ground strikes, the ones that you're referring to in that comment, you normally have an individual human being observing the actual fall of the rounds. So indiscriminately is a term that is being used in the report that I don't think has any justification. Obviously, if I was on the ground, and I did this for 30 years, if I was on the ground adjusting artillery rounds and I saw civilians in the area, there's no way I would be firing against that target, even if the enemy had tried to use those, even though if that was a critical target. If the enemy is going to use civilians as human shields, we're not going to fire that round. We have a very, very measured and precise clearance of fires drill to ensure that we stay within the rules of engagement.
Mark Kimmitt, always great to get your take on this. Live to us there from Washington.